Of the many franchises that rose and fell in the 7th generation of consoles, the one stylistic choice that could be found across many of them was an edgy, more mature tone. Making a modern, hardcore rendition of an older franchise didn't always work out too well. The likes of Golden Axe, Turok and Syndicate all misunderstood what made their respective properties so engaging. The Japanese studio Capcom was also no stranger to this. One franchise that the community really doesn't talk about anymore is Bionic Commando. In the middle of the 7th generation, Capcom began laying plans to resurrect the series, contracting Swedish developer Grin to lead the efforts. It all started with Bionic Commando Rearmed, released in 2008. Back in 1988, the original Bionic Commando achieved a strong cult following with its release on the Nintendo Entertainment System. While the classic console was very well known for its 2D side-scrollers, Bionic Commando bucked the trend. How? By removing the jump button and replacing it with a grappling hook. At the time, this kind of movement had never been done before, and it made for an incredibly unique platforming experience. Some 20 years later, the title will return on modern hardware. Working from the original's established base, Grin focused on preserving the original's gameplay while also taking careful measurements for the bionic arm itself. Did it all come together? Hell yes. The story follows augmented soldier Nathan Spencer as he takes on the forces of Generalissimo Kilt. His objectives are to rescue fellow operator Super Joe and to put a stop to the elusive Project Albatross. This was my entry point into the series, and one of the first major digital releases I downloaded on the PlayStation 3. Using a combination of simple cinematics and some witty conversations, Rearmed immediately makes an impression. Gameplay takes centre stage, and as you parachute straight into the first level, you're immediately drawn in. Mastering the game's swing mechanic is its most satisfying component. It requires solid timing, memorization of the arm's reach, and careful caution around traps. A brief tutorial does a good job of introducing you to the basics beforehand. While you'll head into enemy bunkers to snag some intel, the game is always pushing you forwards. Even on death, you're quickly loaded back in for another run. What makes the levels so thrilling is how they're spaced out enough to chain multiple swings together, an essential tactic if you're looking to blaze your way through them as fast as possible. Skilled players can travel long distances without touching the ground and make short work of enemies along the way. Each level concludes with a one-on-one fight against a unique machine. It's just as much about using your arm as it is your arsenal. Some of my personal favourites included an artillery vehicle that must have its armour ripped off before destruction, and having to leap on top of a hovering platform to take down its occupants. Tackling them once and then again on a higher difficulty wraps up each stage, but you're encouraged to return to them to recover secrets. Weapon upgrades and yashichis are hidden away, and also create some of the most challenging swinging segments. This great level design is backed up by a wider array of enemy forces. Despite its 2D viewpoint, Bionic Commando Rearmed's roster is expansive. Base-foot soldiers, knife-wielding kamikazes, drone operators, bomb experts and robots all have a part to play throughout the game. Being able to carry every weapon at once and not having to worry about ammo ensures there are no bumps in the pacing. Not only that, you can switch up the use of your arsenal to fit the situation. Take the laser gun for example. It fires projectiles that can bounce off the walls and clear a platform before you scale up. As for presentation, what can I say, it's superb. Not only are the graphics incredibly detailed and bursting with colour, the soundtrack is outstanding. Game director Simon Vikund also served as the game's composer, and the remixes he put together add a real rhythmic punch to each level. In a sense, the pieces bridge the gap between old and new, capturing the feel of the original game, while also delivering a stellar modern update. What's even more impressive is the look of the levels themselves. Not only have many of them been redone with improved action, but they're all visually distinct from each other. Heading into the caves in level 4 is much different from swinging your way through a robot factory. To top it all off, the little touches like sound effects in cutscenes and ragdolls falling off the map on death all fill Rearmed with a sense of personality. The only critique I could level against Rearmed is its length. Once you've gotten a feel for the swing mechanics, you can blast your way through in less than 4 hours. Despite this, Grin went the extra mile and offered both local co-op and multiplayer versus modes in addition to the many challenge rooms with online leaderboards. This fully featured package set the standard for downloadable games at the time. With the core swinging action nailed down, the overall package really comes together with these extra features. It all builds up to the final level aboard the Albatross, an atmospheric and foreboding stage that puts all your skills to the test. In keeping with the original's conclusion, it's both challenging and bloody. Your killing blow on the leader explodes his head in a grisly fashion. Rearmed is a truly excellent remake. Despite its smaller size and scale, it belongs in the same camp as Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy VII. I can confidently say it's the finest product Grin ever put out. It goes the extra mile beyond just upgrading graphics and tweaks the finer details. Receiving high praise from both fans and critics at the time, things were looking great for Bionic Commando's revival. Then, 1 year later, it was brought to a screeching halt. Under the same developer, how did Bionic Commando 2009 go so wrong? It's baffling how a team who understood the original classic so well could release such a generic and underwhelming game. It's a victim of the worst symptoms of the 7th generation and forgets so much of what made its franchise so engaging to begin with. I was persuaded to buy into Bionic Commando in 3D thanks to its deceptive looking trailers and the unlockables that carried over from Rearmed. Before we look at the bad, let's examine some positive aspects. The controls and overall feel of the bionic arm are there and accounted for. When moving to 3D, Grin did use this opportunity to add more moves to Nathan Spencer's arsenal. Zip kicking into enemies, punching up and kicking obstacles into them, and hurling foes off into the distance are all fun to pull off. It's as if the developer was so focused on getting the controls right, they forgot to build a design template to work around them. The pacing in Bionic Commando is incredibly hackneyed. The first example comes immediately after attaching the bionic arm. Spencer dives out of the high-rise building with some smooth animations and you're thinking, yes, I can finally get to swinging around in 3D. Then, no less than 2 minutes later, you run into a loading screen. This kind of disruption and limited momentum happens constantly throughout the title, which alternates between platforming and combat. Unfortunately, both of these have their own individual grievances. Before we get to them, let's look at the wider narrative. Story was never a big focus in Rearmed, and the one in its sequel is drab and lifeless. The shift to full-on cutscenes and voice acting went very poorly. Nathan Spencer is voiced by Mike Patton, the lead singer of the band Faith No More, and he turns in an awful performance. All around, there's a seriously rotten attitude to the entire thing. Every character is either angry, barking orders, or both. None of the wit from Rearmed is present here. It's an endlessly unlikable void, and that's before we get to the most infamous moment in the game. Back in Bionic Commando Rearmed, Spencer made a brief mention of his missing wife, and being a sequel, its 3D successor had to pick up this thread and run with it. What was the answer? Do you really want to know? In the closing moments of Bionic Commando 09, it's revealed that Nathan's bionic arm is his wife. So at some point she was killed off screen and converted into a machine. Unfortunately, the game has gone on to be remembered for this ridiculous twist, more so than its core action. As for the wider gameplay, it stands out as being merely passable rather than enjoyable. Enemy and environmental variation has been drastically cut down. You'll be swinging through 3 main areas: the ruined Ascension City, the park, and finally the industrial zone. Standard foot soldiers and biomechs are your only enemies for the most part, and interior corridors are far too prevalent across the game's runtime. Critics at the time bemoaned the lack of exploration. Would it have made the game any better if it had gone open world? At the very least, it would have cut down on the endlessly annoying kill barriers. Radiation and water are often the bane of your existence in Bionic Commando. Yet again, it forgets what made its predecessor work so well. The '09 version restricts your movement and therefore neuters much of the Bionic Arm's qualities. Despite offering some enjoyment, the rewarding feeling you got by chaining swings together is far less frequent here. The gunplay is also very limp. For starters, you can only carry 2 weapons at a time now, and they all run on an ammo supply. This carries through into the combat. Battling biomechs can be incredibly clunky, as your attacks are interrupted and you wait for them to show you their weak points. On top of all that, the title is incredibly light on features. No cooperative elements, no challenge rooms to test your skills, and a rather basic online component that few people played. What we have instead is a series of collectibles, and I say that in quotations because they're arguably the laziest aspect of the entire package. What are these icons meant to be, and why do you have to be so precise to pick them up? To unlock concept art in the main menu and nothing else? No thank you. The last piece of the game's frustrating shortcomings is its cheap difficulty spikes. In the footage you're watching, I played through on normal difficulty, but if you bump it up to hard or commando, be prepared for some serious frustration. Much like Nathan Hale in Resistance 2, Spencer is extremely fragile and can be taken out with just one explosion or strike from a biomech. As underwhelming as Bionic Commando is, it does have a solid soundtrack. You can always count on Capcom titles having great music, and the tracks here often overshadow the action on screen. The Gauntlet is an especially heroic sounding theme. When it kicks in as you're swinging through the environments and taking out enemies, that's the best the game gets. One selling point slapped on the game's box was a set of unlockable extras. By beating Rearmed 100%, you can unlock Spencer's original look alongside a hidden weapon. Well, I did just that and was very disappointed to find that this gun was a pistol that sounded a bit different and did slightly more damage to enemies. So much for the 2D and 3D titles connecting to each other. The game's conclusion isn't much better, as you swing between flying robots via QuickTime events for a cutscene that takes out the final boss for the player. Why did Super Joe turn traitor? Who knows? Who cares? It's never explained in this game, that's for sure. As Spencer falls into the black hole of the Vulture facility, so too did the franchise. Bionic Commando 2009 sold very poorly, with 30,000 units sold, becoming one of the biggest duds Capcom put out in the 7th generation. Notably, the publisher went on to say that their working relationship with Grin was very strained in production. The end result remains incredibly lackluster to this day. Heading back to the drawing board, one more effort into Bionic Commando arrived in 2011. Rearmed 2's development was taken over by indie studio FatShark after Grin ended up going bankrupt in 2009. This studio is now known for their work on the Warhammer Vermintide series, but they started off making smaller scale titles. For what it is, Bionic Commando Rearmed 2 is a passable follow-up, but at this point much of the fanfare surrounding the series had died down. When compared with 2008, there wasn't nearly as much excitement for this title. At the time I completely skipped over it in favour of other larger scale titles. Bionic Commando Rearmed 2 takes place in between the original and its 3D successor, with Spencer and the Federation forces warring with General Sabio. In a bid to increase the scale of the story, Grin and FatShark brought in some unmemorable characters to create the sense of an all-out assault on Sabio's island. What the story does offer is a better sense of forward progression. You get the sense that the protagonist is proceeding deeper into the setting, even if it isn't packing the same humorous wit. The sequel is longer than its predecessor, but in terms of pacing it hits some snags. The overarching design and flow simply aren't as good as the original. This comes down to how levels are no longer designed to facilitate continuous swings. Instead, they go for a more puzzle and obstacle-based format. You're activating switches and turning off obstacles far more than you were previously. Adding a jump button doesn't really hurt the game, as there are still challenges for players to make it through without pressing the X button once, but they can't hide the slower pacing. Often you'll find yourself jumping then grappling to reach the platform that's just out of range. It does take some time to get used to pressing the jump button to come out of a swing, but otherwise things still control very well. The extra step taken by FatShark lies in the new abilities Nathan can acquire, ranging from a shoulder-mounted grenade launcher to a powerful uppercut. Generally, these are used at specific points within the levels and don't form a major part of gameplay. Other levels in the game feel more throwaway than anything else. In a bid to diversify the action, Spencer will hop into a helicopter or turret every so often to blast away an entire platoon. While these sections are mildly enjoyable and make good use of the auto-scrolling style, they're rather shallow when compared to the traditional platforming levels. As you work your way through the game's longer list of locales, it becomes clear that other elements were sacrificed too, namely the boss fights. As opposed to a boss at the end of each stage, levels will often flow into the next one, and this also limits the Bionic Arm's applications. It's a shame too, as these encounters can be very creative. Grappling up General Sabio's flying craft and landing a death from above strike is satisfying, as is ripping the armor off a robot gorilla's face. Yet because there aren't many other adversaries on offer, it's unable to match the first game. From a personality standpoint, the sequel is also rather lacking. Story sequences have far less humour and wit than they did before, and Spencer himself honestly looks a bit silly with that spiky hair and mustache. The music is far weaker too, despite Simon Viken returning as composer. Oftentimes, Rearmed 2 makes use of fairly subdued pieces that mostly try to replicate what came before, and the original pieces it does use get somewhat repetitive over time. Despite this step backwards, the game's graphics and art style remain very strong. The way the game shows external events happening off in the background is very well done, making full use of modern technology for its 2D perspective. In addition, the campaign goes for a more exotic aesthetic, taking place on a tropical island. This allows the levels to maintain the same great variety as the first game. Its commitment to hidden upgrades and secrets is also on point, as the game tallies up your findings at the end of levels. At the very least, the terrible writing and tone of Bionic Commando 2009 were completely ditched, and the result is a far less aggravating experience. Yet despite these changes, some levels in Rearmed 2 will end up testing your patience. This time around there's both an ammo count for weapons and a restart back to the beginning of a level when you lose all your lives. The latter can be tiresome in stages like the Bionic Labs, which feature many hazardous pools of ooze and other dangers. Surprisingly, the game's conclusion ends up making some amends for the 2009 version's lousy story. The final boss is a traitor within the FSA's own ranks, something which sowed the seeds of distrust and thereby led to the events of the 3D title. Rearmed 2 would be the last entry in the franchise. No sales figures were ever released, but it can be assumed they didn't do so well commercially. In the end, what can be said about Bionic Commando? It became a series that spoke volumes of the creative rut Capcom was stuck in at the turn of the 2010s. Unlike Lost Planet and Dead Rising, it ended up fizzling out within 3 years. Having played all 3 titles, my personal theory is that the original NES classic served a solid bedrock for Rearmed in 2008. However, once that bedrock was taken away, the series struggled to continue its push into modern gaming. Since the 8th generation of consoles, retellings of older franchises have become a rare species. If nothing else, Bionic Commando died along with this industry trend. Thanks for watching. Revisiting Bionic Commando offered both enjoyment and some serious frustration to go along with it. Did you ever play the NES original or the newer releases? Let me know in the comments below. You can follow my channel and blog at the links in the description.